Hello and welcome to the NESG Radio. This is a podcast of the Policy Innovation Center. My name is Femi Obidare, Program Officer, Policy Innovation Center of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Today, our conversation centers on the United Nations International Human Rights Day, which is annually observed on December 10th, vis-a-vis the state of human rights in Nigeria. The International Human Rights Day commemorates the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, by the United Nations General Assembly 75 years ago in 1948. UDHR is a foundational document that proclaims the inalienable rights to which all people are inherently entitled. Now, the International Human Rights Day serves as a global reminder of the importance of upholding human dignity, equality, and justice. Each year, the day focuses on a specific theme to shed light on pressing issues related to human rights. This year's theme is consolidating and sustaining human rights culture into the future. Within Nigeria's context, the struggle for human rights continues to address challenges such as corruption, inequality, gender-based violence, disenfranchisement, and limitations on freedom of expression. Grassroots movements, non-governmental organizations, and human rights defenders persist in their efforts to hold authorities accountable and advance the cause of justice. However, the critical questions are: what is the state of human rights in Nigeria? How well are human rights upheld? And what are the imperatives for Nigeria to become a better society where the rights of everyone and anyone are adequately upheld? On this podcast, I have with me two erudite colleagues, Ajibola Adigo, Development and Governance Expert, Policy Innovation Center, and Paulina Urenchi, Project Assistant Gender, Policy Innovation Center. Ajibola, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Paulina.
Thank you very much.
Good to have you both. All right, Ajibola, recently you led a research and you're working on a report of that research, which you led. And the report is titled No Rights, No Remedies: Human Rights Gaps in the Economic and Governance Sectors of Nigeria. Can you shed some light on the scope and objective of that research work?
Oh, yes, it did. So prior to the 2003 general elections, we wrote a report about the pre-election situation on human rights in governance. And this was basically a desk review of different reports. And what we found was that there were challenges with elections, with the preparations for persons with disability. And we also found some human rights reports, such as people trying to emigrate from the country, the popular jackpot syndrome, and all of that. And all of that just goes to show that people are literally voted with their feet because of the state of the human rights situation in Nigeria.
Interesting. So what exactly were you trying to achieve with that research work?
So what we basically wanted to achieve was to look at the gaps basically in human rights in Nigeria. A lot of times people think that the reasons we do not have certain rights in Nigeria is because the government isn't so particular about addressing those rights. But using our approach, which is the human rights based approach, we realize that sometimes it is important to address the real gaps, because sometimes what you don't diagnose properly, you cannot fix. So we decided to look at the real gaps between, is it a resource gap, is it a capacity gap, and is it a gap of transparency? Is it about monitoring? So these were the gaps we tried to address. And more specifically, what we also tried to do was to address these gaps using an agenda setting approach. Basically, we did a report before the elections, and then we did another report after the elections, basically to now say that now that we have a new government in power, we hope that they would use these findings to address these challenges.
Very interesting. You made a very profound point there that what you don't diagnose properly, you cannot fix. And that's one of the things that this research sought to resolve, right? Fantastic. Paulina, I'll come to you. You were part of this research, and I am privy to the fact that you participated in some field work. What key findings stood out for you in the course of the research?
Thank you, Femi. During the research, met with stakeholders, and for people who have worked in this area of human rights work, they you'll see that there was a lot of information. They had a lot of information at hand to disperse to us, to make us understand the present situation of human rights, how people perceive it. If I'm going to go down the lane that I remember during one of the field work, we're told that some people don't even know the rights at all. Before you now say, okay, so you can now say, this is my rights. And now for some that even know, you cannot exercise those rights in our country, and it's a big problem. It's a big problem. And there are other factors that will not allow you to, some of which they were not even ready to, say, because these factors, we know in Nigeria that some people know their rights, but they cannot exercise.
Now you make a very profound point about, there's a matter of awareness, people even coming to know what those rights are. And there's not a challenge of, even when you know the rights, not being able to exercise those rights. I'd like to follow up on that, and either of you can throw some or shed some light on this. What are those barriers that stand in the way of Nigerians exercising their rights? You want to take that, Jibola, first?
Yes, if I may. The Nigerian Constitution says that the primary responsibility of the government is security and the welfare of the citizens of Nigeria. But it seems to me that the government itself and the duty bearers that are supposed to uphold these rights focus strictly on the first part, which is security, and neglect the welfare. So what you have is a situation where socioeconomic rights are not exactly paid attention to. Part of our research was basically focused on the economic sector, right, and the governance sector. More important, first the economic sector. And what we found was that things that necessarily should address the socioeconomic benefits of citizens are not paid attention to. So what you find is that a lot of, for example, things about shelter, about housing, about our food prices are not paid attention to. So, and then you find that there's a widening inequality gap in Nigeria.
So are you attempting here to draw a connection between poor socioeconomic state and the ability or capacity to exercise your human rights? Is that what you're trying to do here?
Very much indeed. In fact, there is a strict correlation between countries that have more freer human rights indexes and their performance in the economic sector. Because the freer you are, in fact, you cannot be productive if you do not enjoy rights. For example, media rights are basically tied to the freedom of speech. And the freedom of assembly is very, very much important to how you fight labor rights. So the freedom to organize, for example, is also very much tied to how you organize and how you. So all those rights are, as one of the respondents said, they are intertwined, they are related, and they are not divisible. One right leads to another, and they are very mutually enforcing.
So was there any part of your research that in some way drew a correlation between the fact that the quote unquote poorer people are, the less capacity they have to exercise their human rights? Does poverty have anything to do directly with that?
Very much indeed. In fact, so it's either that, so one is poor because they do not enjoy rights. Also, it's also the lack of rights that make them poor.
So there's a mutual relationship.
There's a mutual relationship between that. And I'll give you an example with people who live in the border towns, right? So when the border towns were closed because of the importation of rice and all of that, what we found that there were those who were living in border communities who actually became poorer because their mainstay was to do inter-border trade. And of course, when the border was closed, they could not have any sustenance, and therefore the some of them lost their livelihoods and became poorer, basically.
Interesting there. I'll come to you now, Paulina. Were there any gender dimensions to your discoveries in the course of that research that you probably want to shed some light on?
Thank you very much, Femi. I'll talk from the perspective of the basic health facilities we need to have in Nigeria, and citizens of Nigeria need to have access to this now. You can imagine people, especially women, losing their child at birth just because they could not access the basic health services. And so it becomes a bit difficult when you say that, okay, so you have right to this. What right do I have when I go to the health centers or medical centers around me that are government owned, and I cannot access the services? Now, so if the Nigeria Constitution is saying you have access to this, and in reality now, or I'd rather use the word of Mr. Jibola here that will say in practice, you don't have access to it, then there is a kind of shift, and women in particular, when it comes to empowering, and I'm not going to be gender biased. I know that we all are working in that sector to make sure that everybody is empowered, but we see that from statistics that more women needs to be empowered. And now you've taken health, and just the way you said, they are intertwined. And so if you take health out, or you are not very fit, you cannot work, and there's no productivity. And so these things are interrelated, and you can't take them out. So we all need to be fit, and we need to access this basic, and that is what also now leads to the JAPA syndrome. You know that when you go to this country, you can access good health, you access good roads. Everything is just easy starting out, and you're not stressing yourself. So people want to live. So see the way I linked from gender to health to people getting out of the country. So all of these things is like a continuum.
I see that. So that's interesting. Quite a number of important points you spoke about. First of all, the fact that, yes, the Constitution does have certain provisions that's supposed to protect the rights of all Nigerians and citizens, but there's a clear gap, again, to borrow your word, as Jibola normally uses it. In practice, it appears as though the government has not done adequately in either ensuring that those rights are defended or are adequately provided for, as the case may be. But I also spoke about something very important, that indeed access to basic health care should be viewed as a fundamental human right within our nation. And how that is really important. I mean, recently, again, I know that the Policy Innovation Center just concluded the Gender and Inclusion Summit, which sought to simply advance equality through that intersection between trade and health. And you just said it again here that, of course, where there is no adequate supply or provision of healthcare, people can be productive, and that also affects a lot of things. And those are very important questions. I would like to come to Jibola at this point and talk around one of your key findings in that research. There is one of your findings, I remember at the agenda setting workshop, and you did mention something about this concept of security trumps all. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. In fact, I think, like I said, about what the Constitution says about the security and welfare of the citizens. Unfortunately, the emphasis on security seems to be the only consideration that the government has in deploying resources. The flip side, though, is that you cannot have security without welfare. In fact, it is the lack of welfare of citizens that ensures insecurity. And that's the rather paradoxical way that this sort of stuff, the challenges, the government sees it as a dilemma, right? To either choose between security or welfare. In actual fact, there is no division between them. The welfare of the citizens is the primary consideration that ensures security. So speaking about that, I think some of our respondents that I will not mention as one of the duty bearers that ensures security and life says that that security basically is the primary consideration of the government, and that they will do anything to ensure that, even to sacrifice, so to say, other rights. And that's basically I think the fundamental challenge with addressing human rights in Nigeria.
But how do we I mean, thinking through the lens of, for example, that respondent, a duty bearer, we do know that there have been instances where for the sake of national security, just like you said, it almost seemed inevitable not to trump the rights or to sort of relegate the welfare of certain citizens. How do you reconcile that conflict? From your findings, are there any insights towards being able to reconcile such conflicts? I mean, imagine if, for example, a particular citizen is actively involved in certain things that will contradict the territorial integrity or the security of a nation, and there is a duty to ensure that security is maintained. How do you enable duty bearers to begin to reconcile these conflicts?
Well, so the primary responsibility of duty bearers themselves is to ensure human rights. So that's their fundamental responsibility. And when they are duty bearers, it's not a point of gifting. It's not from a point of sympathy. It is actually, they are duty bearers because that's what they are bound to do. For example, that's what the Constitution says that they should provide. In essence, so sometimes when there seems to be a conflict between upholding security and ensuring the rights of citizens, when you take a critical look at it, you will realize that there is a point where you can overcome these challenges. And this is by no means saying that sometimes there are no contradictions, right? But the primary concern of the duty bearer should be how to ensure that you can put these things together.
Okay. So what it means from what I hear you say is that there's a lot of work for duty bearers to really think carefully of how they can actually reconcile or resolve these conflicts, because it's important for them not to keep relegating the welfare of citizens in the name of ensuring security.
So to give you an example.
Perfect.
I will mention, and so the Nigerian police force, right? They do not have the rights of going on strike, right? But I think this was one of the things that they said, that even though they cannot go on strike, yet there are so many challenges that they have in carrying out their responsibilities. To give you an example from the Administration of Criminal Justice Act, which says that all police stations are supposed to have interrogation rooms, but there are very few, if in fact less than 1% of Nigerian police stations have interrogation rooms. What happens is that even the policeman is not capacitated enough to do his job very well. Therefore, when they quell protests, what they have also done is to deny themselves the right of addressing their own challenges. In essence, they are basically, to put it in a pun, shooting themselves in the leg if they deny other people the right of protest, whereas they need those rights to get their own problems addressed.
But I mean, I would suppose are there mechanisms within their establishment, for example, to push for some of their rights? Do you have any insight into that?
Of course, we have, for example, we have a Ministry of Police Affairs, we have a police commission, and all of that. But all those ministries are themselves all in one sector. So what happens is that when you do not have external people to look into your affairs, the accountability mechanism is somehow warped. Basically, the police, the person who heads the commission might be an ex-policeman who is also, they all like they've been together in the same establishment.
Yeah.
So it does not allow for proper transparency and proper accountability measures. And that's basically what you find happening.
All right, beautiful. So we're wrapping up in a minute, and I'd just like to hear from both sides. Yeah. So first of all, I'll come to Paulina here. From your participation in the research, let's talk about one or two strategies that you suppose that the federal government at this point could begin to explore to advance human rights, or to begin to ensure that the provisions for human rights in the Constitution are actually defended in practice. Any thoughts on that?
That looks like a very but let me answer the question. Okay, so one of the major problem, or one of the things identified on the field is not that the government is not aware of this rights and that people have access to this right, but they are denied. Now, okay, so let me cite the NSAS protests.
Yes.
And I will say that Nigeria, Nigeria failed our own during that protest, because people held on to their rights. And holding on to their rights, the government that has put so much, or is giving priority to defense, used that against the people. And so the people lost. There was the trust, and everything is gone. You know the story of the Hensas, and even after that, it was still a very bad scene out there. So now we are back to the government.
Okay.
I think it's only the government that can redeem her image by knowing, making sure that people can, their rights, they can exercise their right at any time.
Very well.
Because that's what happened during that. I use that as an example because it's something we can all relate with.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So Jibola, what final words would you have, possibly away from the government now? And even if you want to talk about the government, you can still go ahead and
yes.
do that.
So the first thing I will say is that human rights is basically just sustainability practice. By incorporating human rights in our businesses, in our economy, that's the only way to ensure sustainability in our practices. Because what happens is that when you have more people that are included in the governance and the business sector, if one falls, the other can lift the economy up. For example, if we've been reliant on one form of economy before, and there's a shock in that, by including other parts of the economy, of the sector, they can help to help each other along. Now we are having the incursion of AI into our business practices. So if you do not carry people along, what happens is that you leave too many behind. And talking from the right holder's perspective, it seems to me that one very, very major finding that we found in our report is that, in fact, there are very, very wide skill gaps in even right holders knowing what they want to do and how to do it. And I think the way to go is collaboration between right holders, so that their activities can have very maximal impact.
I like to add that looking at the framework that was used for the research, one of the major things is accountability and transparency. If the Nigerian government can be transparent enough with what they do with the people and the access to human rights, in Nigeria, I think people will come to trust them. And if there are external bodies holding us accountable as a country, it will help us.
Thank you so much, Jibola. Thank you, Paulina, for your time. I'd like to end by giving this reminder that the International Human Rights Day has an overarching goal to foster a culture of respect for human rights, to encourage solidarity and empower individuals to stand up against injustice. And so it is again a reaffirmation that the shared commitment of the global community to building a world where every person, regardless of race, gender, religion, or background, can live with dignity and enjoy their fundamental human rights is very critical. Thank you so much, colleagues, for your time. And once again, thank you for listening to this podcast. We will certainly see you again another time. Thank you.